Welcome to Mark D. Maker. We're finally ready for paint. So let's bring this guy down and get him painted. First step we want to do is seal it. I use Fabulon. It's kind of hard to find, but if you can find it, great stuff. It soaks in without leaving any kind of residue on the outside of the wood. Now here we have flow medium or flow helper. We got some gesso, and I'll talk a little bit about all of these things as we go on. A little bit of flow medium in the gesso, a nice moppy brush. It actually says Siberian squirrel hair on it. Oh, poor squirrel. And lots of water in that gesso. And we're really gonna mop it on. This is really thinned out. It's thinned to about the consistency of skim milk. It's very thin. You see how it just flows very easily. I hold the bird upside down to get in all the little nooks and crannies. The flow medium, and there's a bunch of different names for it, helps it to flow and even out, prevent brush strokes. You'll have to catch little drips as they happen. Now the gesso, when it starts to dry, can get like a crumbly effect. So once you have a coat on there, as long as it's wet, you can go over it again. But once it starts to dry, it will get like sandy or gritty. You'll end up having to wash it off. So if it starts doing that, just stop. You'll have to wash it off and start the process over again. So as I mentioned, the gesso, as it dries, can become crumbly. Well, the same thing can happen on the bottle that the gesso comes in. So before you squirt out any gesso or pour out any gesso, make sure the area around the cap is clean. You don't want those little crumblies getting into your paint. Here I'm going over, you can see the gray part is where I put in 2-part epoxy up around the wing. There's a muscle there that kind of bulges out as they fly. And holding it upside down, you can see as the gesso goes on thin, sometimes it does wick away a little bit, and you'll have to go over it, but you want to go over it the second time before it dries. So you got to kind of work a little bit fast. This is sped up twice the speed, so you don't have to work that fast. But as you put it on, it is sealed. The wood has been sealed with a sealer. And so it's not soaking into the wood. It just is attaching to the sealer. Now, if you put your fingerprints, your greasy paws, on the bird after it's been sealed, the water-based paint will wick away from that area. That's why the painting stick. Boy, that can really drive you nuts because you're painting, trying to get it primed, and the paint and the water just they'll go right away from the oils. They'll wick right away and leave a bare spot. If that happens, a little bit of water and a drop or two of dish detergent, and you scrub that area until the grease gets dissolved or the oils become dissolved. Rinse that off, and then you start again. It's just easier to use a stick like I have here, and try not to touch it after it's sealed. Now, I've talked about the sealer in previous videos. It's pretty difficult to find the Fabulon Prime. I have seen it online occasionally. It's hard to find, but it's worth having. I have not used anything else. I've had a gallon of it, and I've been whittling away at it for the past, gee whiz, like 10 years. I'm not sure what I'm going to use when that runs out. It has to be thin and it has to soak in. You can't use like a lacquer or a shellac, which lays on top of the wood. It has to soak into the wood. You don't want to clog all those little lines that you took all this trouble to burn into or to carve into. So if you can't find it, let me know what you use, and we'll share as a community to help other carvers. Now, on the belly of the bird, where there's really no burn lines, it's mostly stoning and carving the little lines in. I use gesso in a thicker consistency, not as thin as I do on the feathers. When I start doing the feathers for the wings, I'll really start to thin it out. But in the chest area where there's no burn lines, I use practically straight without thinning it out. There are some carvers that compete that actually do not use the gesso at all. They will use paint color and apply the color right onto the wood and try to let the burn marks show through a little bit. There's a ton of different techniques. This is the way that I learned through who I consider to be my mentor. That would be Floyd Schultz, who's won multiple world championships. And believe me, I'm not comparing myself to him. He's a world-class carver. But this is how he does it. This is how I learned through watching his books. He's got a video that I highly recommend. His video where he carves an American kestrel. It's available on his website, and it's $50. It would probably be the best $50 you ever spent if you're interested in doing this kind of carving. He is an excellent teacher. All right, I'm going to slow this down to actual speed here and show you. This is about how fast I'm moving. And the reason why I'm doing this is I want to show you, see all these little bubbles that appear? as the paint is trying to get down into all those little cracks and crevices, you get all these little bubbles. It's really important before that dries to brush those out. Smooth it out. Try to get as smooth and as uniform as you can get. Now, some of the lines are going to be so dark, you'll see them through the paint. That's okay. You want to try to get the surface though as smooth as possible. If those little bubbles pop, they'll leave raw areas where there's no paint, and you want to try to avoid that. All right, so just finishing up here with the gesso. Just about done. Took about 30 minutes to give the bird a full and thorough coating. Looks pretty good. About ready to go in and start with a little bit of airbrushing. This is an Aztec airbrush. It is all plastic. It is super easy to use. I used to have a standard airbrush, and this is just so much easier. Here's the colors I'll be using: burnt umber and ultramarine blue. Now I got a little ahead of myself. I should have added a little bit of white to this, so it ends up coming a little darker than I wanted. This is Flow Aid. I mentioned that before. Especially important when you're using your airbrush. Now I'm using Liquitex paint. It's a soft-bodied paint, which means it just squirts out. And I love these new nozzles that they've put on their paint. Really, really convenient for squirting out certain amounts of paint. They just pop on and off. So I'm using 50% ultramarine blue and 50% burnt umber. There's already water there. There's already flow medium there. Take a nice brush here. It's a long bristled brush. Holds a lot of paint. And as you can see how dark that's getting, it's almost like a black. It's really a very, very dark gray. I use this for most birds. Most birds will get this color somewhere on them. Now the reason why I don't use black and I use this mixture is black absorbs color, and this is actual color that reflects color back. It's a perfect color for birds. Now you can add white to this and get all the way up to a very, very light gray. And I actually should have added a little bit of white to this to lighten this up. I actually applied it too dark. So if I was doing this again, or giving instruction on how to do this, add a little white to this paint, because I actually went a little too dark here. Adding the paint that's thinned out a lot with water. I've added a lot of water here. This is the consistency of ink, maybe. It's very watered down. And I will take this, a little test here on the paper to make sure it's not spitting or spattering. And multiple things can do that. Low air, too thick of paint, running out of paint. There's a bunch of things that can cause issues. And we'll start adding in shadows in the deepest lines of the bird carving. So see, right underneath the feathers in these deep lines here, I'm going to come in and just accentuate the deep areas. It'll help give it a more three-dimensional look. Now the Aztec airbrush that I use is fairly inexpensive, is one of the least expensive airbrushes on the market, made by Testers, which is a model making company. It is the same airbrush that Floyd Schultz uses in his classes. He teaches classes in Vermont, and these airbrushes are what he uses to teach his students. You can set them up to where they're a single action or a double action by the little silver barrel on the back end of that brush. So it's a very versatile brush. You can a double action simply means push down for air and pull back for paint. A single action would be as you push down, you get air and paint at the same time. There's more control with a double action because you can control both the air and paint at different rates. Now, one thing about airbrushes are they can be difficult to keep clean. As the air exits the tip, the paint can dry out and clog the tip of the airbrush. The Aztec is designed a little bit different. The tip you can literally unscrew and just drop in water. It's real easy. There's no needles to deal with the Aztec. I simply shoot water through it to clean it, and then I'll spray, shoot a little Windex into it, and that'll clean it and lubricate it. All right, you can see there was some spatter. See the little spatter marks? I will just go in with an X-Acto knife and just knock those off. That's because I'm using a canned air. If I was using a compressor, I probably wouldn't have had this spatter. My can is freezing. I'm using it, spraying, and the can literally gets a coat of frost on it and starts to freeze up. And so you have to pause or put the can of air into a pot of warm water to keep it from doing that. So here's a little quick tip. These cans do freeze up. And so something you can do is put this in a pot of warm water, or use these guys. I just pop some of them and stick them right on the can, and they stay nice and warm, and just occasionally give the can a shake with those things stuck on them, and they seem to do fine. All right, we got a little raw umber and burnt umber and some gesso. We're going to mix these together. And thin them down. And we'll start to airbrush with them. All right. Alright, put on the little paint cup and we're going to fill the paint cup using the brush. Just transferring the paint right into the brush. The paint right into the cup using the brush. You could use an eyedropper or whatever other means to get the paint in there. Remember, it's thinned out so it sprays. Do a little test to make sure that it's going to spray through, and there we go. This is actually the color that I should have been using instead of such a dark color. Now there is a way to remove unwanted paint or color from any kind of a carving that you have like this, and that would be to take a small shot glass with water in it and just like a cap full of rubbing alcohol, probably a couple of drops would actually even do just fine, and a stiff bristled brush, and just scrub, and that alcohol will loosen and take away the paint. Especially airbrush paint is a lot of times it's easier to remove than brushed on paint, so you can just scrub it with a stiff brush, little paintbrush that's stiff bristled, and it would remove that. But instead of doing that, I'm just going to paint over it with this. We'll make it work. I'm not that worried about it because this is not a competition bird. This is an art piece, and I think I'll be able to make it just fine. Alright, so now we're going to brush in that same color paint. We're going to brush in the head, the back, and the back of the wings. Now this is very wet, thin paint, so it doesn't clog up all those little lines. You can see all those little lines shining through there. Just in case you didn't notice, I am surrounded by reference material all the way around me. I have books, pictures, all kinds of stuff. So because the paint that we're using right now is very thin, more like a watery stain, you'll get a lot of drips. And so you have to be vigilant. You'll paint for a while and just give it a while. You want to take your brush and clean it off, clean it with the water, and just have your brush damp, and just dab the paint drops that are accumulating. They'll accumulate literally right on the ends of the feathers, and so you want to absorb those up with just the touch of a brush, and that way you don't have these the paint accumulating on the ends or in any places on the wings. Now this is water-based acrylic paint, And one thing about water-based acrylic paint is it is transparent. Now the gouache is not. It's opaque. And that's why the gouache goes down first. It's opaque. It kind of hides, covers up, and gives tooth, so the other paint can stick to it. The acrylic paint, being acrylic, water-based, it's kind of like a plastic coating, but it has a transparentness to it, so you can see down through it. So you can see down through that brown, and you can see the shadows that I put on there before. All right, so here's where we're at right now. We'll continue to do a little bit more airbrush work on them and block in some more colors before we start the details. Hope you enjoyed this video. Please like, share, subscribe. I'll see you next time.